You're losing your regular job, losing your regular income. I was in a very nice position. I was one of the youngest directors, London board directors made. You know, I had a lovely company car. I had shares. I had all the things. And let's face it, the status of, you know, what do you do? I'm a director of Sotheby's. It's a very nice social tag to have. To then go back to just being a, you know, what are you? Well, I'm a dealer and I trade out of my apartment. Oh, really? Okay. So that was tough.
From Arcarta, this is The Bigger Picture, an inside look at the businesses that make the art world work and the stories behind the people that shape them. Founded by Robert and Michelle Bowman in 1993, today Bowman sculpture is synonymous with one name in particular, Rodin. Raised on a farm, starting out as a receptionist and rising through the ranks to become the director of European works of art at Sotheby's, to then leave at the height of his career to open his own gallery. Robert's story is inspiring and evidence that with enough persistence, passion and patience, an art world outsider can become a significant voice. So you're not from an artistic background, you can't paint or sculpt, you've got no formal education and you had no connections to the art world. And the only reason, correct me if I'm wrong, that you didn't become a farmer was because your middle brother took up the position, leaving you to find something else. So the question is, how did you make that first step from a farm in Kent?
Well, I think if I'm honest, when I saw how hard my father worked, and I'd worked a bit on the farm, I realised that probably that wasn't the ideal career for me. My middle brother did, thank goodness, come home and take over the family farm, so that took away the responsibility from me and my other brother. But in reality, I just saw how incredibly hard farmers work. So having experienced that, I think I was looking for something else.
And how did you go from the farm in Kent, though, to working in the world of fine art? Were you serious about pursuing a future in art, or did you see Sotheby's as a stopgap? How did you transition from the farm into the art world?
Well, originally I was fairly alternative and had lots of strange jobs, including working as a lifesaver in a swimming pool and various things like that. And eventually my father said to me, look, you know, I've given you a great education, but you really do need to do something with it. So I went off and actually studied accountancy. And unfortunately I hated it. I decided that wasn't for me. I then completed my first year. I do actually have my part 1 in accountancy, my foundation course, which has actually stood me very well in. It had stood me well in business, I must say. I can look at a set of accounts and understand them, so that's good. But the initial introduction was actually a friend of my parents who happened to work at Sotheby's. I said I wasn't doing anything, and he said, have you ever thought about the art world? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'll see if I can get you a temporary job. So I got a temporary job as a porter for the first big house sale, which was Lord Rosebery's estate. It's called the Mentmore Towers sale. And I was a porter for that, taken on as a temporary guy.
And you progressed from being a porter to working on reception, which involved what exactly?
In those days, lots of things used to come in via off the street. People would just walk in and say, I've got this, can you tell me what it's worth? Really long before the advent of emails and photographs, electronic photographing. So we had a lot more things coming in off the street, and there were 4 reception counters, and each reception counter had 2 receptionists on it, and people would bring things in, and then it was down to the receptionist to call the relevant expert down.
Right, okay. So the question is, I think, having dug into this a little bit, into your background, who was Colin McKay, and how did he have an impact on you?
There's a wonderful guy called Colin McKay, and he was head of the Chinese department. And he used to give me an incredibly hard time because they were on the 3rd floor and the Japanese were on the 4th floor, and there was no lift. So if I called him down to look at a plate and it was Japanese and not Chinese, and trust me, that's often quite difficult, he would go ballistic with me. So there was one classic occasion when nervously I asked him to come down and have a look at a plate, and he came down and he said, oh yes, Robert, this is very nice. It's Chinese, 18th century. Can you tell me who the owner is? I introduced him to the owner. The owner stood up and he picked up the plate and he said, well, this is absolutely beautiful. This is Chen Lung, probably about 1730, 1732. Not earlier, because it's got this little pink decoration around the outside. And really, you only really see the introduction of this pink colour after about 1730. And if we turn it over, I can see from these particular firing marks on the back that it's from the northern part of the province. And he went on and on and on about this place. And I just thought, God, you are magical. And then he turned around to the owner and said, well, a single plate like this, I would have thought perhaps £3,000-4,000. Do you have more than one? And she said, actually, yes, I've got 10 of them. And he said, oh, that's marvellous. As a large group like that, they're worth much more. And I would have thought that probably we could have been thinking of somewhere around £50,000 to £60,000 at auction for the set. Would you like to auction them? And she said, oh, I'd love to. And there was this, he had this combination of this incredible authority. He was beautifully dressed in a kind of Savile Row suit and the whole thing. And I just thought, I want to be you. I want to be the guy that could just walk down, look at something, and with utter confidence, tell them just by looking at it where it's from, what it's all about, and of course what it's worth.
Mm-hmm. So what was that next step from there then? So you're blown away by your experience with Colin Mackay and what he represents. You almost feel that your future is somehow bound to that or similar to that. So while working on reception, correct me if I'm wrong, but you applied to be a junior cataloguer for every post that came up. What happened?
Yeah, no, that was the thing. Well, basically, I just applied for everything, and I would go for an interview, and they'd say, so tell me, what do you know about medieval manuscripts? And I would say, well, absolutely nothing, but I'm a quick learner. And they said, so tell me about your interest in Japanese ceramics. Do you have a degree in Japanese works of art? And I said, I don't even have an art O level, but I can learn. I'm a fast learner. And so they all just shoot me away. And then eventually, I camped outside one particular director's office every day during my lunch hour, and I just drove him mad. And eventually, he said, "Oh, for goodness' sake!" So he phoned up the personnel department and just said, "Look, for God's sake, give this guy a job." So I got this permanent job working on the counters, and from then on, I continually applied for numerous jobs. And eventually, someone in valuation said, "Look, you don't have any great specialist knowledge, but you seem to be very keen. So what we're going to do is we're going to put you in as a junior in a series of departments so that you can educate your eye generally, and then you'll join the valuations department. And the valuations department are people who are sent out around the country to look at large houses or collections of things, and they then say, right, they then spot things, see if something's really worth seeing, and then if it is, you then get the top specialist down to have a look at it. But obviously, you can't send a specialist out all around the country. You have to send a general value around, and that general value, then it's their eye that then allows them to decide whether it's worth calling a serious specialist in or not.
And during that time when you were sort of experiencing this, was there anything that stood out in your mind initially while you were working in valuations? What sort of things caught your eye during that time?
Well, I originally, the majority of things then were furniture. So I started in the furniture department, and then in 18th century English and French furniture. And then I then went down to the 19th century, where I was looking at 19th century furniture, but also works of art, clocks, watches, sculpture, everything like that. And it was during that period that I suddenly thought, there's a big area here in sculpture which is treated as decoration at this stage, but in fact it is actually fine art. And there's really, this is worth having a specialist department to represent it. And that's really what started my complete passion for sculpture, that I realized that this was an area that really was just sort of lumped in with furniture and works of art. And I really felt it was worth having its own specialist area.
So that feeling of this having its own area of specialism, was there anything emotional though that drew you to sculpture at that age that kind of blew you away?
Yes, I think that what I'm always looking for in sculpture, and this is a kind of recurring theme going through what became my passion, is the fact that when you look at something and it has an emotional effect on you. And it's all very well looking at painting. I get pleasure from looking at paintings and fine art generally. But the fantastic thing about sculpture is it's three-dimensional. It has to work from the front, the back, and the sides. And I've suddenly thought to myself, this is so much more skillful than portrayal just in two dimensions. And the combination of that, what I perceived as an incredible skill, and the fact that a lot of this sculpture produced in me an emotional reaction, which when I talked about it and explained it to other people, they seemed to see it in the same way that I saw it. And I think it was that really cemented my passion for the subject, that, when you have the ability to look at something and tell people what you see in it, and they then see it after you've explained it to them, you become a conduit for their passion for art. And I think that's really what cemented my own interest in the subject.
Yeah. So are you, at this point when you start to discover sculpture and it really connects with you on an emotional and an intellectual level, are you burning the midnight oil now, reading and consuming information? I mean, I guess this is before the days of the internet, whereas you've already touched on, where everything is now open and everything's kind of accessible. How are you acquiring all that knowledge?
You're absolutely right. It's basically burning the midnight oil. Whenever I wasn't at work, I took reference books home. We had very extensive libraries. I went to as many museums as I could. I went to many exhibitions as I could. But the key factor, in fact, the most important factor, is that when you work for the largest auction house in the world, which was Sotheby's at that time, you are seeing a fantastic quantity of things. And when you look at those things, you're also seeing them with senior people around you who can educate you. So I'll pick something up and say, oh, this is very interesting. And then there would always be someone more senior than me with 20, 30 years of experience. You could say, well, actually, Robert, that's this, or actually, that's that. I remember there was one particular guy who worked at Sotheby's who had a collection of fakes, and that's just what he collected, just fakes. But they weren't copies, they were fakes. They were things that would fool 90% of the population. And I think it's that level of expertise, being surrounded by that level of expertise, in combination with seeing a fantastic amount of things, that really educates you fast, very quickly.
So learning on the job, essentially, and burning the midnight oil, those two things combined, you very quickly acquire that knowledge. And I guess there are certain things that I feel that are coming through in what you've said there that can't be learnt in books. You literally have to pick up, feel and touch these things and interact with the object. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's what it is. You can't replace the years and years and years of looking at something. There was a classic case recently where a client of mine asked me to go and look at something that was coming up at auction. And I went and looked at it for him. And I said, look, it's perfectly genuine, but it's just not really a great example. It's just an average one, and it's just not good enough for your collection. And I went round to supper with him a few weeks later, and sure enough, there it was, sitting in his study. And I said, oh, I'm very surprised that you bought that, considering I told you that, I think it was that great. And he said, but, I spoke to the head of the department, and he said it was the best one he'd ever seen. And I said, you know what? He's 28. I'm 62. It is the best one he's ever seen.
So true. So true. So, but would you say you were drawn to sculpture today for the same reasons that you were back then when you were 28, or has this changed over time? How does your eye evolve over time, and how do your tastes change? Do they evolve, and in what way?
I think your tastes change with exposure to increasing amounts of art. And also I think one's taste develops. I remember being very, very passionate about Art Deco things initially, because they were obviously producing a very strong and obvious emotion. They were very stylish, visually very, very appealing. But over a period of time, that period has become less interesting to me, and I've become much more interested in the Impressionism period, and in fact going towards the modern period. And I think that's just, it's like wine, isn't it, really? We all start off with, I don't know, Mathieu's Rosé or something like that, and think it's delicious. And then, over a period of time, your palate develops, and I think in the same way your eye develops with sculpture. And I think that's part of the reason that still keeps me so excited about it, that I'm still learning and still finding areas that I really, really am passionate about, which perhaps 4 or 5 years ago I might have looked at something and thought, well, I just don't get that. That's just two pieces of steel welded together. And yet now I'm a huge fan of people like Robert Adams and Anthony Caro and people like that, who are making relatively abstract sculpture out of pieces of welded steel. I'm now very passionate about that, but I can tell you 5 years ago, I probably would have thought, well, I don't really get that.
It's an interesting theme. It feels like, many of the best things in life are essentially what we're saying potentially is they're an acquired taste. You acquire the taste over time because of exposure, your experience, your understanding. That deep interest or fascination with something. You can go through those multiple levels of fascination. Do you think that's accurate?
Yes, I think you do. I mean, I think it's not for everyone. Some people find an area that they like and they love, and that becomes their passion, and they steep themselves into it. I've got collectors who know more about particular artists than I will ever know. Because it's their great passion. But on the other hand, they don't perhaps have expertise over 200 years. And in general, I think that narrowing is admirable because they have an incredibly specialist knowledge. But to me, that's limiting. I'm always still looking to look and appreciate something new.
Mm-hmm. So let's just go back, if I may, to the period in time when you were at Sotheby's, and you've gone through valuations. You're being exposed on the job to all these works of art. You can see that sculpture as a discipline is somewhat maligned, perhaps, maybe that's too strong a word, but it's certainly not an area in and of itself. It's kind of lumped in with, as you said, furniture or decorative art in one sense. But you then go on to become a junior cataloguer, eventually becoming director of European works of art for Sotheby's. What was that transition like, and what type of things have happened during that period in time? Can you remember?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination. Obviously, you're working for a commercial organization, and I had a commercial eye, and I think that's what's allowed me to go on to be a dealer, is that I saw value in things. And I think that it's that ability when something comes in that you can see what it's worth, who it might appeal to. It's an ability to market. The whole auction world is a complicated and sophisticated business. But I think my value, to the company was that I was able to see potential areas that could be expanded. For instance, one of the things I did completely off field was that I suddenly noticed that people were starting to collect wristwatches. And so I went to the senior directors and I said, I think we should be selling wristwatches. And they said, what are you talking about? Well, with Sotheby's, we don't sell wristwatches. And I said, well, I think that there is a new market coming up here, particularly for men who can't really buy themselves jewelry, but want to have something that is distinctive about them that perhaps portrays their sophistication or their wealth or whatever it may be. And I said, I think this is going to become a big collector's market. So they said, well, you go ahead and do it. So I went to a few people who were dealing in the area, put a sale together, and we had a really successful sale of watches from 1920 to the 1950s. And that has now developed from, I started those sales, and they got so big that they then set up an independent expert and specialist just to deal in that area. And now wristwatches completely are much greater importance financially to the auction than ordinary clocks and watches, regular pocket watches and regular clocks. So I think that's where Sotheby's perhaps saw my ability was the ability to develop new markets. And that's what I did with sculpture. I took on different areas, promoted particular artists who perhaps had been ignored, and then reminded the world of, through the catalogues and through expertise and through advertising, how important that particular artist is, and then expanded the value of that artist. We then became known as the people that if you wanted to sell a work by that artist, you should take it to Robert Bowman at Sotheby's, and we then built that market. And I think that's why my career path ascended relatively quickly, because I had that combination of passion for the art, but also a commercial eye.
Yeah, that commercial intellect. I have no idea about your connection or history to watches. That really is very interesting, because that now is a huge collector's market. I mean, I'm thinking about websites like Hanneke, for example, where they represent a very, very strong international contingent of collectors of watches, vintage wristwatches in particular. That's really, really fast. So what period of time would that have been where you were seeing, you had that foresight, that commercial intellect to say?
It was 1982. I held the first, 1982, the first sale of vintage wristwatches at Sotheby's. It was at Sotheby's, Belgravia, yeah.
Wow, I had no idea. That is really, really early. I mean, I think Hanneke, which is now I've touched upon, one of the kind of major online voices of an international watch collecting community. I think that's probably that was maybe started in 2009. So wow, 1982. But ultimately, you did go on to leave Sotheby's in 1993 to strike out on your own, as many are now aware, to set up your own gallery. What prompted you to leave, if you don't mind, if it's not a rude question?
No, it's a series of things. There were one or two things. There was one thing going on in my personal life, which had an effect, but I felt that my life was changing. But I think, secondly, from a sort of Sotheby's perspective, I was being increasingly drawn into senior management. So what was happening was that I was effectively losing touch with the objects and becoming more and more, basically moving towards becoming a divisional head, whereby you're in charge of several departments. And I'm not really a corporate man. I'm not a corporate manager. Had I wanted to do that, I would have gone into a corporate structure in business. And I was becoming increasingly, therefore, a businessman and a manager, a people manager and a business manager, rather than having an everyday touch with the objects. And that's what originally drew me to Sotheby's. That's what originally created my passion in the art world. And I realized that if I wanted to continue to do that, I had to go on my own and become a specialist in a particular area that I had a niche expertise for and also a passion for.
Yeah, so you were almost, by virtue of your success and that commercial aptitude, that saw you become distanced from the thing that you actually wanted to do the most, which was hands-on interaction, as opposed to becoming, as you said, a people manager and a manager of time and resource and so on and so forth. Well, how did your family react all the way back in Kent? How did they react to you saying, "I'm leaving Sotheby's"?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think initially there was fear, and I think you're losing your regular job, losing your regular income. I was in a very nice position. I was one of the youngest directors London board directors made. I had a lovely company car. I had shares. I had all the things. And let's face it, the status of what do you do? I'm a director of Sotheby's. It's a very nice social tag to have. To then go back to just being what are you? Well, I'm a dealer and I trade out of my apartment. Oh, really? Okay. So that was tough. So I think certainly worry from my parents' point of view, that they felt that I was giving up a potentially important career, but tremendous faith, I think, in that both my father and my mother had always recognized in me a wheeler-dealer aspect, the ability to see something, think, well, that's worth a bit more than that, buy it and sell it, and also my pleasure in creating new markets, and I suppose also fundamentally being a salesman. And I think that hopefully they had faith that those skills would out. Having said that, I think one of the big skills that a lot of dealers need, which perhaps a lot of people leave the auction rooms but then don't make it as independent dealers. And I think that the key factor there is having that ability to do a bit of everything, to be able to do your accounts, to be able to move things, to be able to understand advertising, to be able to understand all these different things. And it's not, when you're a dealer, it's not just buying and selling. That's an important part of it, a very important part of it. Buying right and is the key, and it makes it easier to sell when you bought it right. But there is, when you're running your own business, there are a whole multitude of skills that one has to have, as well as just that ability to spot a good thing.
It takes enormous courage to strike out on your own, especially from a position of status and comfort and success that you would have had with Sotheby's at that moment in time. I mean, fast forward today, and while your daughter Mika is heavily involved in managing the business, if I'm not mistaken, it was your wife Michelle. She was very much instrumental in helping develop the business during its first 5 years, very much the backbone. I'm curious though, did you both have a vision in mind for Bowman Sculpture back then? Because success never goes in a straight line. It's never night and day. It's going to take a period of time. So how did you evolve the idea for Bowman Sculpture? I mean, had you been thinking about this idea for a while?
Yeah, I think what I had was a series of people who I knew were professionals in terms of they were scouting around the world looking for things that they thought were worth more than they could buy them for. So in a way, I had a source over the years I was at Sotheby's. I'd obviously developed a very nice collection of people who were effectively dealers, but who were working with me at the auction room, and they would work with me because I would promote the objects, I would do the research, I'd take great photographs of the things and promote the thing, and I would then, in the auction, be dealing with the collectors, the people who were the end users for these things, and I would explain to them why something was good and why it was important and all that. So I was a conduit between those two. So actually, by leaving Sotheby's, I still had buyers and I still had sellers. So actually, instead of being a conduit for a huge corporation like Sotheby's, I was able to go off in my little specialist market and be the conduit just on my own.
That's fascinating. That's very, very interesting. So let's go back to thinking about launching Bowman Sculpture.
Yeah.
Who was your first full-time hire?
I was very lucky. I had a friend, well, someone I knew in the trade, whose daughter wanted a job. So I took her on as a sort of secretarial position. I had another couple of friends of daughters and friends of friends who wanted to do some part-time work, and they worked with me on a sort of secretarial basis. But this one lady, her father had a lease on a gallery in Duke Street, St James's, and she'd been working for me for about 6 months, and she said to me, "God, my dad's very scared about this recession that's coming, and he just thinks he needs to get out of the gallery." And of course, when I left Sotheby's in '93, we were at the bottom of a really bad recession. The early '90s were pretty tough times. So I'd left at the kind of bottom of the market as such, and he was just scared that it was going to continue on. So he was quite desperate to get out of his lease, and that was the most lucky thing for me, because he said to me, "If you take my lease on now, I won't charge you any commission. What's the word I'm looking for? There's a premium that you have to pay if you're taking over someone's lease, if it's an advantageous lease, if the lease is below market value." So I was incredibly lucky. He was called Mayorkas, and he was a dealer in textiles and carpets. And he said, "Look, take my lease over. I think that world's going to go into a much worse place. If you still believe it's going to be on the upturn now, take my lease over. I won't charge you a premium for taking my lease on, but you've got to move in now and take it over." So that's what I did. So his daughter Mimi introduced me to the father on a more serious term, and that was my first gallery at number 8 Duke Street, St James's.
And of course, things did pick up, as things invariably do in time. What was the first work that you sold? Do you remember?
Yes, I mean, I sold a lot of things because initially I didn't have any capital, and the one thing one does need, and even in relatively inexpensive 19th century sculpture at the time, one does need capital. So how I was originally trading was I would go to a dealer, have a look at their stock and think, "Oh, that's quite nice. So can I borrow that for a day?" Then, because they knew me and trusted me, they'd lend it to me. I'd then get on taxi or whatever, go up and make an appointment to see a potential client, take it in and say to them, "Look, I've got this thing, what do you think?" And I just try and put my elbows in either way and try and make a little margin between what the dealer wanted and what the collector was prepared to pay. And that's how I really started dealing in the first place, was just by borrowing things, because I didn't have the capital. over a period of time, I then built up the capital. And I remember my first really proper piece that I bought with my money and sold was a sculpture by someone called Falguière, and it was a sculpture of a naked woman called Phryne, and it was based on a painting by Gérôme, and by the Orientalist painter Jean-Léon Gérôme, peering out from underneath her arm. Other than that, she's completely naked. And so you get this lovely sort of sense of sensuality of this woman saying, oh gosh, I'm naked, and yet very clearly being aware of the effect that she's having on the viewer. And that was the first sculpture I sold, and it's called Phryne, and it's by Falguière.
That's incredible. I mean, I think more interesting, you are known, your name, the Bowman name, is now synonymous with Rodin. The concept alone is pretty incredible, that you have created a brand synonymous with the one name that people they associate sculpture with Rodin. The two are intrinsically linked. How does something like that work? How do you create a brand and a gallery and a business that becomes synonymous with the one name in sculpture that people connect with? How do you do that?
Well, in terms of expertise, obviously, I was lucky that I was exposed to incredibly expensive and very beautiful sculptures at Sotheby's. So I learned about the different sculptures, the different foundries, the different qualities, the patinas, and all those things that are important when you're buying a Rodin while I was at Sotheby's. But in terms of establishing oneself as the specialist dealer, it just takes an enormous amount of time. You have to be seen to be dealing in it. You have to be seen at the various art fairs to be holding stock by the artist. And then over a period of time, you're seen to be buying things at auction. That's that Robert Bowman. He's just bought that Rodin there. Oh, he's bought, that's Robert underbidding that Rodin. And so your reputation spreads in the auction world. It spreads amongst dealers. It spreads amongst collectors. And then, of course, now with the internet, someone who's interested in Rodin will go on, they'll put in Rodin, and they'll see the stock that we're holding. They'll see the various articles that have been written about me and the business over the years, and what we specialize in. And then we hold exhibitions, and I write extensive catalogs and produce dedicated catalogs just on Rodin, and do dedicated exhibitions. And then I'll lend things to museums that I've sold to clients. And so over a period of whatever it's been now, 27 years, you gradually build up that association. And I think now, certainly, hopefully, largely amongst the trade, certainly, and hopefully amongst collectors, people will now say, oh yeah, Bowman, Rodin, yeah, it's Bowman's, that's the guy who deals with it. And I have to say that in the last 6 months, some of my most significant sales have actually been through the auction rooms, who have contacted me and said, look, we've got a client looking for a thinker. We've got a client looking for a kiss. What do you have? And because they know I hold stock, they are now coming to me to say, as the seller, saying, we've got a buyer. Can we be the intermediary? So it's sort of come full circle, really.
Full circle, yeah. So just to continue on this thread while we're talking about Rodin, a few years ago now at Tefaf, you sold She Who Was Once the Helmet Maker's Beautiful Wife to the curator of the Van Gogh Museum, Edwin Becker, though you credit the sale to your wife. Can you tell us what happened there?
The sculpture is of a rather sad, aging old woman who's bent over, crippled with arthritis. And I think it's incredibly powerful sculpture. It really reminds us all, if you think of the title, She Who Was Once the Helmet Maker's Beautiful Wife. And so it's this indication of this woman who was clearly incredibly beautiful when she was young, but now is bent over, twisted and crippled by age, and she's depicted nude by Rodin, and she has this sort of sagging flesh and sort of sagging breasts, and the sort of skin is sort of hanging off her. She's very thin and very old. So it's quite a tragic sculpture. And we had it sitting on a column with a light shining in front of it. And my wife was showing it to someone, was turning it round. And as she turned it, the shadow that it gave from the front was the shadow of this bent over figure. So there was a bent over figure in the shadow. But she noticed that as she turned it, the shadow, as the figure twisted, became the shadow of a beautiful young woman, upright. And I don't know, I can't imagine that Rodin created that intentionally, but that's what happened. And the curator of the Van Gogh Museum was on the stand and he was looking at it. And my wife said, look at this, isn't this interesting? And he was just completely spellbound by the fact that the shadow changed. As you twisted the figure around, it went from this bent over old figure, straightened up, and became this rather tall, slim, elegant woman, as indeed the helmet maker must have been when she was young.
It is incredible, but you don't think that he would have done that knowingly? You don't think Rodin would have constructed that piece of sculpture knowing that if you cast the shadow at a certain angle, that it would turn into the lady in her youth? You don't think he would have known?
I've never heard it mentioned before, so I think it must be chance, but I think that quite often genius does create incredible things. I think that when you've got genius, a lot of genius is imbued in the subject, but a lot of it comes out with chance. I'm always fascinated to see how great poets, write beautiful poetry, and then you see people interpreting it, and you think, did he really think of all that? Is there really that depth in that poem? We'll never know, will we? But I often think that once people accept someone as a genius, they look for beauty, they look for something extra that genius has provided, and often that genius does provide it.
The impact Rodin's had, though, on the world of sculpture is significant, and while someone might not necessarily know the thinker by name, they'll certainly know it by sight. In your eyes, why do certain works cross over into the mainstream like this, and what do you think is the appeal to essentially the uninitiated, those who don't collect? What makes people able to appreciate art like that?
I think it really refers back to this portrayal of an emotion. And when you see a great work of art, it produces an emotion. Obviously, in terms of how many people it communicates with, if that sculpture only talks to 5 people, then it has relatively little impact. But when you have a sculpture or a work of art that really communicates across the board to those who are perhaps not normally sensitive to art, but that particular image speaks to them, then it becomes iconic. For instance, in the case of a thinker, one of the questions that we all ask ourselves is, why are we here? What is our purpose? What is the meaning of life? And the thinker represents that. The thinker represents mankind in thought, really thinking about where we've come from, where we go to, is there somewhere we go to, all those philosophical questions. And those philosophical questions may not be a specific question, but the figure of the thinker represents mankind thinking about philosophy. And I think that's why it's so incredibly popular, because it's a universal image of man's thought process, man as a thinker, as opposed to animals who are existing, someone who actually considers their own purpose and their place on the planet.
Do you think Rodin was an innovator at heart?
Yes, it's interesting. My feeling about Rodin is that I think that on one level we see things like the kiss, which is again another iconic image, the image of romantic love. It's one of those images that you see everywhere, the embracing couple, and it is an eternal image of romantic love. But actually, my feeling is that Rodin is not the great innovator for the thinker. He's not the great innovator necessarily for the kiss. It's for his other works where he imbues his sculpture with an emotion which creates a reaction in the viewer. But also he then says, but look, let's just not look at complete figures. Let's look at part figures. Let's look at a hand. Let's look at a torso. Let's look at part of a body. Let's look at what those particular things show us. And by minimalizing the human figure, by taking sections of a human figure, what he does is he invites us to consider Impressionism. He invites us to consider minimalism. And it is from those figures, it's from those studies of individual sections of the human body that he examines closely, that we then get the beginning of abstraction. And the fact that when you look at a Rodin hand or you look at a Rodin torso, it's not representational. I mean, it doesn't look, if you actually compare it to a real hand or a real torso, it doesn't make sense. The muscles are over-muscled, the fingers are disproportioned. But it's presenting the idea of the emotion that image, that part of the body can create in you. And that is where Rodin is important. He is, in fact, the father of abstraction, because he's the one that takes individual sections and looks at them in abstracted form.
Do you think that level of abstraction and impressionism is perhaps what makes his work accessible to people on the outer sphere of that academic knowledge, someone who's not necessarily a collector, but the fact that his work has transitioned so fluidly into mainstream, where we're all suddenly aware of works of like you said, the Kiss and the Thinker and Michelangelo's David, these pieces of sculpture that are intrinsically bound to what makes us human. Do you think it's that abstraction that makes it accessible?
I do, and I think that is really a large part of the responsibility of the artist. The artist is seeing things that, by expressing it in a certain way, they take us on a journey whereby we start to see the possibilities of an object beyond our initial concept. And I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why Rodin is that father, because had he just produced something completely abstract, we would have looked at it. Majority of people, particularly back in the late 19th, early 20th century, would have said, well, I don't know what that is, just looks like a blob to me. But actually, he did it in such a way that you saw the beginning of it. He took you on that journey. He takes you away from reality and starts abstracting things. And it's that journey introducing you that then allows you then to go on and look at someone like Arp with just doing or Brancusi just doing a very soft shape, and understanding that soft shape could be a bird or could be an arm or could be a body. That we now look at a Henry Moore and say, oh yes, that's a reclining nude. If someone had produced a Henry Moore in 1900 and produced it in front of people would have said, well, what on earth is this, And I think that's exactly right. I think he's that transitioner, that ability that takes us up to starts us on that journey, which we then continue with other artists as we go through the 20th century.
Do you know what? The words just come to mind, and it's a thread that occurred earlier in the conversation. Rodin is almost becoming a conduit in some way. He's opening the eyes of someone to see the world as he sees it and see if you can connect to it. And poetry and all that kind of must fall under this category in some way, do you think?
Absolutely, I do. And if you think of the great writers, Rainer Maria Rilke and the philosophers of the period, the poets of the period, they were often associated with Rodin because they saw in him that greatness. They saw these great poets and writers saw in him this transitional period. Even if you take someone like Nijinsky, there's a wonderful sculpture that Rodin does of Nijinsky. And what happened was that Nijinsky does this, he creates his first ballet that he choreographs and stars in. And it's called The Faun. And the critics and the public go along and they go to the opening performance, and when it finishes, they just don't know what's hit them. It's this bizarre, this sort of jumping about, and they're used to, classical ballets like Swan Lake and things like that. And here is Nijinsky choreographing this very intense modern ballet, and they don't know what's going on. So then Rodin then goes along to the second performance, and he stands up afterwards, and again the audience are bemused, and he stands up and he says, he claps, walks to the front of the stage, and he says, "You've often called me the father of modern sculpture. What we've witnessed today is the birth of modern dance." And again, here is a man that understands that appreciates that. And I think that his fellow artists, poets and writers and philosophers recognize that inspiration in his art.
Mm. Now, fast forward to today. Let's get into contemporary sculpture. You actually, as a gallery, you deal in a multitude of works by contemporary sculptures. So artists like Emily Young, Maurice Blick, Richard Hudson. what is attracting you as Bowman Sculpture to their work, and share with us an introduction to the work that these artists are producing today?
The first point, the thing that attracts me, people say, why do you take on a particular artist? Well, obviously, I would love to have lots of artists' work who I admire in the gallery. So, but to a certain extent, it's a question of, are they fair to work with me? Are they people that are represented by the galleries? But one thing that I think is a theme that goes through the artists that we represent is what I call an artisanal quality. I'm not someone who really understands as yet, perhaps I will do in the future, but I don't really understand conceptual art forms. I don't really get a big buzz out of a series of illuminated letters saying love or passion or something like that. For me, there has to be an artisanal quality. There has to be something that is being created by the artist. And I think this is what's so fantastic in someone like Emily Young's work, is that she starts off with just a lump of rock. Doesn't have a plan, just a lump of rock, a chisel and a hammer, and she starts carving into this stone. And as the stone reveals itself, the folds, the colors, the striations, she starts thinking, oh, that could be interesting. That could be a nose there, or that could be an eye there. And she carves into it, and then suddenly something may change. You may suddenly say, oh, no, that's not going to work out. It's actually going to be a torso, or it's going to be something else. But there is a creational process. There's an artisanal quality. And if you then look at the other artists, for instance, Hanneke Beaumont, who I represent, she's a woman who starts off with clay and just takes a lump of clay and starts modeling and comes up with an image which when she's happy with, she then has cast in bronze. So I think that's the common theme that's going through my work, through the artists that I represent, is that there is, all of them have this artisanal quality, this ability to work, to create something physical as opposed to conceptual.
Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's the complete reverse of, for the most part, the mass-produced world in which we live as consumers, and the very, very nature of the way that these artists are creating things and that artisanal quality that you've described is the complete reverse. Everything is handmade, and that process of exploration as they work their way through that material is surely got to be the attraction, don't you think?
Yes, I agree. I think so. I mean, I think, how often have people sort of walked into a gallery and looked and said, well, I could have done that. And I think the bottom line is that everything I sell, you couldn't do, and if you can do, please come and show me your work because I'd like to represent you. And I think that is exactly that journey. I think that there is a respect for craftsmanship. There's a respect for not only craftsmanship, but creation, because you can carve something and it may not turn out very well. But I think that's what it is. It's that combination of an artisanal quality, but also combined with that creativity.
I'm just curious. I'd like to just dwell a little bit more on Emily Young's work. How does Emily start her journey? What's her background? How does she get to a point where she's working as a professional sculptor and in the way she does, and with the stones that she uses? What's her background?
Well, she went to art college, but then I think really sort of left the accepted art world and went and travelled extensively in India, and she then came back and she was also painting and sculpting, and then gradually over a period of time it was sculpture that really came to the fore. And the reason that she is particularly associated with stone is that she has this great passion for the earth and for its creation and for understanding rocks and for stones and marbles and how they're created. She never ceases to amaze me how much knowledge she has about the individual types of stone that she's working and how hard they are and how soft they are and the different images that she could make. So I think with Emily, it's been a journey of a combination of obviously an innate artistic talent to create, but also her involvement with the Earth and the planet, and how the whole of our planet has developed, and therefore her passion for the stone that she works with.
Mm-hmm. I think just to wrap up, one of the things I'd like to touch on is the name Bowman is obviously, as we've said, it's synonymous with sculpture now, and you've obviously built this business up over the last 27 years, 20 odd years. And you've already touched on, actually, you were talking about when you were starting out and that transition from going from Sotheby's into your own business, that you were wearing a lot of hats, and you have to almost be able to do that by virtue of running a business. And is there anything else you would give in regards to advice for somebody starting out as a dealer or as a gallery?
Yes, I think, firstly, just reiterating your point, it is being in business on your own is a business, is something of multi hats. You can't just be the salesman or the expert, or you've got to do the person. You have to write out the invoices. You have to do your VAT return. You have to deal with the landlord of the rent of the building you're in, and all those different things. And I was lucky in that, because I came up through Sotheby's as a junior, I had experience on all those things. By the time I left, I obviously had administrators who worked for me, and porters who moved things, and restorers who did the restoration for me, and all those things. But at least I understood how those things worked, and due to my early accountancy period, I also understood a little bit about accounts. In terms of advice to people starting up, I think it's very important to understand where your skills are, where your skills aren't, and get the right people to work with you that can complete your ability. So, for instance, you may get someone who's the most brilliant dealer. Someone like Danny Katz is someone who is known as being someone who has a fantastic and unique eye. But behind him are always a series of really good, solid people who do his research, who'd handle his accounts, who do all those things. And as wonderful as anyone may be in a particular area, they do need other people that fulfill in the skill sets that they perhaps don't have.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other side of the coin, I'd be curious to hear what advice you would give to someone starting out as a collector.
Yes, that's an interesting area as well. My feeling is this, that if you're really going to be a serious collector, then you do need to seek out the people with the greatest knowledge and passion in that field. And although that obviously sounds like I'm singing from my hymn book, if you go to auctioneers for advice, they are only selling what they've got, what they've been given to sell, and their primary interest is to obviously sell the object, because if they sell the object, they get their commission. When you're dealing with a dealer, the dealer, specifically if he owns his own stock, has gone out and bought those things with his money or his or her money. And because you're buying with your own money, you don't ever buy something you don't genuinely believe is fabulous. We can all make mistakes. I've made mistakes, but I do think that that's very important. And because of that financial and emotional commitment specifically to that specific area of the art world, the dealers and the gallerists actually represent an enormous source of both passion and knowledge, far greater than can be found anywhere else. So my advice to a potential collector is, if you're interested in collecting in a particular area, find a dealer you can get on well with. Say to them, look, this is why my financial position is, this is what I want to buy, I want to learn about things, and a good dealer will take you on that journey. He will say, well, within your price bracket, I think this is something you should look at. Have a look at this. And then they develop it. Now, have you thought about this artist? Have you thought about this movement? This could be an interesting area for you to go. And a great dealer will be able to share not only their knowledge and passion, but also their financial expertise at showing what you should be buying at the right time in the market, what things are going to go forward, which areas are going to hopefully increase in value, and all those other aspects. So that's my advice to any collector starting out. Find a dealer in the area that you are interested in and make them your friend. Become a client. And you can be tough with them. You can, as a collector, you can say, look, this is it. This is what I want to do. But in in return for my giving you my loyalty as a collector, you must give me your loyalty as a dealer and give me some great deals. Find me some great things at the right price.
There's that word again, I feel, coming up in my mind as I've listened to you describe that conduit. The dealer is going to take that collector on a journey over a period of time, over that relationship, educate them, help them make the right buy, help them see the beauty in things that they might have otherwise miss, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think that's all part of that process. And I think, as then going back, I know that my wife, when I asked her why she fell in love with me, she said, "You know what? I heard you talking about art." She said, she was at an art fair and she came onto the stand and saw me talking about something and explained to someone what I saw in it and why I thought it was beautiful. And I think that's what it's about. It's about being a good dealer. We'll be able to take the person on that journey and say, "Now, you should look at this." And the collector will say, "Well, I don't get that." Yes, but look at it for this reason. Do you see this connection? Do you see that? And that is a journey which, for me, is invaluable and really has been the central passion in my career.
And that's it, isn't it? That's the eye that you speak of, that you were referring to Danny Katz earlier. That's the eye that the dealer has, that they're going to help somebody see something in a slightly different way that they may have otherwise have missed.
Yes, absolutely. And it is that eye, it's that taste, it's that judgment. And that's very simple. I think you go into someone's gallery or go onto their stand at an art fair and you think, "Well, I quite like this stuff. This is nice." So you then speak to the guy or woman who has bought those things and it's their taste. And then you say, "Well, can you tell me about this? I'm interested in this piece over here." I mean, establish that relationship. There's nothing more than a dealer enjoys than sharing his passion for that particular object.
Mm-hmm. Robert Bowman, thank you very much for your time and your input. This has been a real joy. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can follow and subscribe to The Bigger Picture wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about this episode or to reach out to us directly, please visit arcarta.com.